Hello music fans. So June 16th was a crazy release day for metal, rock, and prog music. I listened to 11 albums that came out that day, and now I want to give you my first impressions of them and talk about them in my order of preference, starting with a wild one from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. They pretty much went full-on prog metal for the first time. They released an album called, I'm going to have to read the title of this because it's very long, PetroDragonic Apocalypse. That's like the short title, but if you want the full title, it's PetroDragonic Apocalypse, or Dawn of Eternal Night and Annihilation of Planet Earth and the Beginning of Merciless Damnation. So kind of apocalyptic theme here on this album, which is similar to another album that came out on June 16th that I'm going to talk about later. So it seems like a lot of these metal and rock bands are singing about apocalypse and the end of the world. This is progressive thrash metal, which is not their usual genre. It's the 24th album by this great Australian band. They make albums and songs in many different genres, with an emphasis on psychedelic rock mostly, sometimes progressive rock. They made a thrash metal album before called Infest the Rat's Nest, and this is their second metal album in their vast discography of 24 albums. They've also made some jazz fusion albums. Sometimes they go as far as dream pop and hip hop, so they are very versatile and diverse. And this album sounds similar to Infest the Rat's Nest from 2019. It has that thrash metal style, but this one is more progressive. My first impression after just 2 listens is that it's even better than Infest the Rat's Nest. I think this is a contender to be in my top 5 King Gizzard albums overall, but I'll need more listens to decide for sure. And yes, I can basically say they've gone and made a prog metal album for the first time. So it's nice to hear them playing my favorite genre of music. I've always loved their albums, even though they're more psychedelic rock, which isn't my main genre that I listen to. I focus more on progressive metal and progressive rock. I've always enjoyed them, but now it's really cool to hear them making an album in my favorite genre. I love all the time signature changes and odd time parts on here. The energy and the aggression of the guitar riffs, drumming, and the vocals is also just really fun. The tone of the guitars sound like Metallica to me, but the complexity of the songs are beyond anything Metallica ever did. If you like Megadeth and Metallica but want to hear music done with the craziness and quirkiness of Mr. Bungle and the rhythms and atmosphere of Tool, this is an album you should check out. It's funny to me that Gila Monster was the first single they released, because I feel like that might actually be the weakest track. So if you just checked out the single and didn't really feel like you wanted to listen to the album, give the whole album a listen. I suppose Gila Monster, it does have the catchiest chorus with the gang vocal chant, so it's more of like a good sing-along song, so that's probably why they picked it as a single. But my favorite tracks are Dragon, Converge, and Flamethrower. Next I want to talk about Avkrvst. So I think you pronounce the band name, it's spelled Avkrvst. So there's no vowels in there, but the V's are supposed to be like U's. So it's Avkrvst. They made it really easy to Google their band names, because if you spell it right, they will definitely turn up. So definitely doing some good search engine optimization there, Avkrvst. And their album's called The Approbation. This is progressive rock with metal influences, and it's a debut album. They're a Norwegian band, and the first single they released, The Pale Moon, sounds kind of like Opeth around the Blackwater Park time, except with a bigger focus on the softer parts with clean vocals. There are growls right near the end of the song, but most of the album sounds like a mix of Porcupine Tree and Opeth, and it's mostly clean vocals with just a couple parts where they go into the growling vocals. The last song on here is a long prog epic that has some parts that remind me of King Crimson. And this is a really strong debut album. It cements this as a band that I will follow every release of going forward. I think it's the best debut album of the year that I've heard so far. This should make my year-end top 40. My favorite track on here is Arcane Clouds. Next, I want to talk about Sigur Ros and their album Atta. This is ambient post-rock with classical music influences. It's the 8th album by this Icelandic band. This is very beautiful and peaceful sounding cinematic music with minimal percussion. It's very slow music. It's kind of sad to the point where it could bring you to tears, but it's also like hopeful and uplifting at the same time. Very like movie soundtrack at like a sad overcoming an obstacle part. Like that's kind of the vibe I'm getting, the feeling from the music. The lyrics on here are, as usual for Sigur Ros, are not in English. They primarily sing in Icelandic, but they also sometimes sing in a made-up language that they call Hopelandic or Vonlenska, which has a lot of non-linguistic vocalizations that just sound good with the music. And this album sounds particularly good because they feature a full orchestra on here. My favorite track at the moment is Blodberg, I think it's pronounced, and it means blood rock. Next, I want to talk about Queens of the Stone Age and their album In Times New Roman. This is alternative rock with hard rock, stoner rock, desert rock, I think they call it. Maybe a genre that they kind of made up. It's kind of blends alternative, hard rock, and stoner rock all together. And this is their 8th album. They're an American band. They've got such a great and unique signature sound that's immediately recognizable and iconic. My favorite albums from this band are Songs for the Deaf and Like Clockwork, but this one is almost on that level, so it might actually end up being my 3rd favorite album of theirs, but I'll need some more listens to say for sure. Another great one that came out on June 16th is by a band called Thy Catafalque, and the album's called Alföld, Alfold, and this is like avant-garde post-black metal with a lot of experimental and progressive rock influences thrown in. It's the 11th album by this Hungarian band. I heard the early release single Nema Vermek, and I thought the contrast between the synthesizers and the intense harsh metal and dissonant riffs sounded cool, so I added it to my list to listen to. And this album went all over the place. It's a black metal album at its core, with mostly black metal shrieking vocals, but there are some clean vocal sections, some sections that almost sound like dance music. There's a flute in some parts and a violin in other parts. All in all, it was a wild adventure listening to it. If you like the release from earlier this year from Dodd Heimsgard, also known as DHG, called Black Medium Current, I think you'll like this as well, as it reminds me of that album and how avant-garde and all over the place it is, while still having that black metal core to it. And so far, this is probably my 3rd favorite black metal album of the year, after Enslaved and Dodd Heimsgard. If you count all these as black metal, like they're more progressive and avant-garde black metal, which, as you can tell, I prefer that progressive and avant-garde black metal over the more straightforward black metal stuff out there. So you've been warned that you'll be getting into something weird if you listen to this album by Thy Catafalque, but if you're ready for that, check it out. Next, I'll talk about the other apocalyptic album similar to King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. It's an album by a band called Fifth Angel, and it's called When Angels Kill. This is heavy metal with power and progressive metal influences, and it's the 4th album by this American band who started way back in 1983. They put out their first album in 1986 and their second album in 1989, and then the members went their separate ways for a couple decades. They didn't come out with a 3rd album until 2018, almost 30 years between their second and third album, but now they're back with their fourth album. And I heard the single When Angels Kill, and the riffs there are just really cool on that song. So check this out if you're a fan of 80s Queensryche and Iron Maiden, but with a little more power metal thrown in, like Halloween and Blind Guardian. And this seems to be a concept album about the end of the world to me. I didn't really closely study the lyrics, but there's some spoken word parts that make it seem like that's the theme. The vocals remind me of Ronnie James Dio. The guitar solos remind me of Megadeth and Symphony X. So check this out if that sounds appealing to you. It ended up being a lot better than I expected, so I'm really curious to hear their earlier material now. Let's see, I've got 5 more albums to talk about. This will be a long video, What's New 2023, but hopefully there's some really good stuff in here that sounds interesting to people, and let me know in the comments your thoughts on all these albums, and if there's any that you heard that I don't mention in this video that you think I would like as well. So let's jump into talking about the next one, which is Methedras and their album Human Deception. This is thrash metal with death metal influences, or that's at least how they describe their sound. To me, it had a lot more depth to it than that. There's a lot of different genres thrown in here. It's the 6th album by this Italian band, and I heard the single I Was the Truth before the album, and it was pretty groovy. It had a catchy chorus along with like brutal chugging riffs and screams in the verses. And this particular song to me sounds like it has some hardcore, metalcore, and deathcore influences, and even some symphonic influences. Even though the band is listed as just like a thrash death band, they have a lot more sprinkling of almost every type of metal music on here, from thrash to groove to death to black metal to metalcore, symphonic metal, even some hints of prog. There's not much, if any, clean singing on this album though, so be prepared for something extreme if you're going to listen to this. I guess they never really ventured into doom or power metal territory though, but they really touched on all the other main genres of metal at various points on this album. I think fans of Lamb of God and Slayer will like this, as it kind of sounds like those bands, but with a lot of sprinkles of other influences thrown in there. Next up, I'm going to talk about Alt and their album Abeyance. This is melodic metalcore with post-hardcore, pop, electronic, alternative, hard rock, and groove metal influences, and it's a debut album by this Australian band. If you're a fan of some of the modern metalcore bands that have this kind of more pop, electronic, accessible sound to them, like Architects and Bring Me the Horizon, this sounds a bit like recent music from those bands, but the 2 singles I heard from this album ahead of time sounded even more exciting than those bands. I kind of got tired of Architects and Bring Me the Horizon. Don't like the direction that those 2 bands have gone in, but this album by Alt is really interesting. It's nice to hear a fresh take on this poppy, electronic, groovy, melodic metalcore. Really great performance for a debut here. Next up is Motorpsycho with their album Yay, and this is acoustic psychedelic rock with indie, alternative, and progressive rock influences. And it's the 26th album by this Norwegian band, so they put out a lot of material. This is very chill acoustic rock with some psychedelic vibes, but nothing too crazy on here. This is accessible enough to play for people who aren't into music that's too adventurous, but it does have enough musical moments that are interesting to keep hardcore music enthusiasts interested as well. And next I want to talk about Sons of the Tundra with their album The Only Equation. This is progressive metal / rock. It's not too extreme here. It's the 5th album by this English band. It's a really solid progressive metal album, but it didn't stand out enough amongst all these other releases, so it's not going to make my top 40 of the year or anything like that, but I do still recommend checking it out if you're a fan of progressive metal. There aren't any harsh screaming vocals on here, so it could be a good gateway album into progressive metal for people who can't handle the screams as much. And I think people who like the early prog metal stuff like Fate's Warning and Queensryche will like this, but it's also got hints of more modern influences like Tool and Mastodon. And the last album that I want to talk about is by Steve Lukather, and it's called Bridges. And this is rock album. It's got some pop, some jazz, some progressive influences as well, and it's the 9th solo album by this American guitarist, singer, songwriter, arranger, and record producer who's best known as the sole continuous founding member of the rock band Toto. He's a great guitar player and songwriter. The songs on here are pretty good and well produced, but they all sounded a little safe to me. Nothing was really memorable or adventurous enough for me to latch onto. And that's it for my first impressions on these 11 albums that came out on June 16th, 2023. Hopefully there's something on this list that sounds interesting to you. You check it out and you enjoy it. Let me know what you think of these. Let me know if there's any other cool ones that I should check out. And until next time, peace out.